state of Manipur has been consumed with ethnic conflict since early 2023 between the Meitei and Kuki peoples. The chaos still rages today, with hundreds dead and tens of thousands driven from their homes. In this video, we'll explain how this violence came to be, what has happened to both sides, and why the Indian government is finding it so hard to fix. We must begin by introducing the history and demographics of Manipur. The Meitei comprise around 60% of Manipur's population and have been there for millennia. There were Meitei kings ruling there as early as 33 AD, before Hinduism even reached the region. Like most of India, they became Hindu and were eventually conquered by the British. The ruler of Manipur became a client king of the British Empire from 1762, acting as a useful ally against neighboring Burma. It was the British who first suggested importing the Kuki. Traditionally hailing from the Kuki-Chin hills across the Myanmar border, small numbers of Kuki were in the Manipur region before the British decided to import more. The British and the Manipuri king believed the Kuki could act as a buffer to the Burmese, and settled them in the hills around and above the major Meitei settlements in the Imphal Valley. Today, the Kuki make up around 15% of Manipur's population. Eventually, the British defeated Burma in the Anglo-Burmese War in 1828. With that, Manipur lost its important security role. The British continued to control the region though, and their rule had two important consequences. First, British missionaries mostly converted the Kuki to Christianity, sharpening the cultural and social differences between the groups. Secondly, to keep colonial administration simple, the British kept Meitei together in the Imphal Valley, while keeping the Kukis up in the hills. This made both of them easier to rule, but it also prevented the two groups building strong inter-ethnic relations. Also into this mix, we should acknowledge the Naga. Comprising 20% of Manipur's current population, they entered Manipur in larger numbers during the colonial era, mostly from neighboring Nagaland. Like the Kukis, they became Christian and live mostly in the hills. In 1917, when the British pressed Manipur for more troops to support the First World War, the Kukis launched a rebellion. Meanwhile, the Meitei and the Naga generally stood with the British. The 2-year-long conflict, known as a war to the Kuki and a rebellion to the Meitei and Naga, fueled ethnic tensions between the groups. The British successfully suppressed it in 1919, but diverging attitudes towards the historical event remain a touchy subject. Indian independence in 1949 did not heal the ethnic divides in Manipur, and new conflicts or problems emerged to worsen the situation. From the start of independence, Naga separatist groups in neighboring Nagaland brought tensions and sporadic episodes of violence to Manipur. Communist militias also arose seeking a communist alternative to a union with India. Ideas of Manipuri independence were also floated. Manipur was eventually incorporated as a union territory of India, and only achieved full statehood in 1971. Following a long and exhausting process of reorganization and advocacy. But even this change failed to solve the area's problems. New militia groups continued to emerge through the 60s and 70s. The Meitei-led United National Liberation Front formed in 1964, seeking an independent Meitei Manipur, while communist groups like the People's Liberation of Manipur and the People's Revolutionary Party of Kangleipak, both probably backed by China, created a lingering insurgency in the state. Kuki groups, chiefly the Kuki National Organization and its armed Kuki National Army Wing, created yet another armed faction wrestling for power and a voice in Manipur's affairs. All have contended or conflicted with the Indian central and the Manipuri state governments ever since. Of course, these militant groups make up only a fraction of the population of Meitei, Kuki, and Naga, but they exist because of economic, social, and political issues that affect everyone. Economic inequality is one of the biggest sources of ethnic tension. The Meitei community, concentrated in the Imphal Valley, receives much more of the financial investment in infrastructure than the hill regions. The distribution of schools, hospitals, and other key resources is weighted massively in favor of the Meitei, and the Meitei are generally better off with better paying jobs and more wealth than the Kuki or Naga. According to one assessment, despite making up 90% of Manipur's land area, just 10% of government investment went into the hills where the Kukis and Naga live. This lack of economic opportunity and poverty among the Kuki has led to social decay and made illegal activities an appealing alternative for young people who see no other opportunities. Politically, the debate over reservations and scheduled tribe status has been fierce. As scheduled tribes, the Kuki and Naga receive a guaranteed quota of jobs, university places, and seats in the state legislative assembly. But Kuki activists have long argued that these reservations are disproportionate and do not give fair representation to the Kuki. For example, 19 of Manipur's 60 seats in the state legislature are reserved for tribal peoples, or less than 1/3, despite them being 40% of the population. It is also argued that these provisions are regularly ignored in practice by the Meitei-controlled government. The ineffectiveness and limited powers of local government in the hill regions has also contributed to a sense of alienation and powerlessness for the Kuki. After years of low-level fighting with Kuki militant groups, the government reached a suspension of operations (SOO) agreement with them in 2008. The two sides agreed to a truce, and the government would grant more powers to Kuki communities, in exchange for the militant groups agreeing to be lodged in special camps, where their activities could be monitored. It was an imperfect solution, but the SOO agreement managed to curtail the violence through the late 2000s and 2010s. The trigger for the most recent unrest came not from India, but Myanmar. In January 2021, a military junta overthrew the government, triggering a civil war that continues to this day. Like any war, it generated a refugee crisis. Tens of thousands of refugees from Kuki and Zo groups in Myanmar flowed over the border into Manipur. For the Kuki, these were their kin, and most were welcomed with open arms. For the Meitei and the Indian government, this unwelcome wave of illegal immigration was a danger to security and stability. These concerns were not unfounded. Militant and criminal groups used the refugee crisis to shift their operations into Manipur, and violence increased. On November 13, 2021, Colonel Viplav Tripathi of the Assam Rifles was returning from a community outreach event in the Churachandpur district when his convoy was attacked by Naga militants. As was standard for community events, Colonel Tripathi's family, including his young children, were with him. Tripathi, his family, and 4 soldiers were killed in the ambush. These were Naga militants, not Kuki, but the blatant attack was a shocking sign of the disorder building in Manipur in the wake of the refugee influx. The worst of this disorder centered around the drug trade. Hill areas of Manipur were converted into poppy farms to be used for heroin production by certain military and criminal groups, many of which had come in as refugees from Myanmar. This triggered a harsh response from Manipur's chief minister, Biren Singh, who cracked down on the hill regions in the name of a war on drugs. The Manipuri government claimed to have destroyed almost 20,000 acres of poppy cultivation land by early 2023. Kuki activists countered that the war on drugs was just a cover for a crackdown and ethnic cleansing of the hills. They pointed to the implementation of so-called environmental protection laws, which were used as justification to clear out dozens of Kuki villages, designating 38 Kuki villages for eviction in November 2022 alone, as proof that it was all part of a larger plan of ethnic cleansing against the Kuki minority. The breaking point came from a Meitei petition to be considered for scheduled tribe status. With Kuki refugees flooding in, many Meitei felt their dominance in their ancestral homeland of Manipur was at risk. If immigration continued as it was, the Meitei would become a minority in their own homeland within years, placing their language and culture under threat. Therefore, the Meitei sought permission through the relevant government channels to be declared a scheduled tribe. This would grant them additional protections and privileges that Meitei activists claimed would protect their culture. The request offended the Kuki, Naga, and other tribal groups of Manipur. They argued that the Meitei already enjoyed immense privileges and unfair advantages, and to add the scheduled tribe status on top of that when the Meitei was still a clear majority in Manipur was absurd. On April 20th, 2023, the Manipur High Court agreed with the petition and directed the state government to begin the formal process to recognize the Meiteis as a scheduled tribe. The Kuki reaction was immediate. There were protest marches in the streets, and the first reports of ethnic violence came in. On April 28th, a mob of Kuki protesters burned down an open-air gym in Churachandpur district, where Chief Minister Biren Singh was due to appear hours later. Police were sent in and clashed with the mob. Violence and rhetoric worsened over the following days. On April 30th, a Kuki man named Hanglan Muan Vaifei was arrested for anti-Meitei social media posts. He died in custody, probably at the hands of violence from the mostly Meitei police officers. Then, on May 3rd, activists organized a tribal solidarity march to oppose the Meitei scheduled tribe application. Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets, where they were met by counter-protesters from the Meitei. Sources disagree over who attacked who first on May 3rd. The Meitei blame the protesters for launching attacks. The Kuki protesters insist it was the Meitei. 2 Kukis killed in Kangvai village on May 3rd by a Meitei mob might be the first casualties of the new wave of ethnic conflict. The Anglo-Kuki War Memorial was also desecrated by Meitei protesters, which was a deep symbolic insult. Violence spread like a wildfire in the following hours. Mobs of Kuti and Meitei emerged, clashing with each other and then turning on those who wanted nothing to do with it. The streets of Churachandpur saw some of the worst violence, with Meitei and Kuki mobs clashing with stones, fists, Molotovs, and other weapons. Despite the tensions, Meitei and Kukis had mingled over the years. There were Kukis in the Imphal Valley and Meiteis in the hills, but now they were vulnerable. In Kuki territory, mobs attacked and burned the homes and businesses of Meiteis, forcing some 9,000 people to flee on the first night. Meanwhile, some 15,000 Kukis evacuated Imphal Valley, as Meitei mobs came for them. Entire villages like Dolaitabi, Ekoi, Yankaman, and Leitanpokpi were cleared out in a matter of hours. By the end of the day, dozens of people were dead, and hundreds of buildings had been looted or destroyed. The government responded with police and thousands of soldiers. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, was invoked to grant the military additional powers to suppress the unrest, including a shoot on-site order for the militia groups, but the violence was spreading too quickly to contain. Within the first week, almost 90 people had been killed, the vast majority of them Kukis. The violence was worsened by social media, which was awash with claims of attacks by one ethnic group or the other. For example, widely circulated photos claim to show a Meitei woman's body after being raped and murdered by a Kuki. By the time it was discovered that the photos were of a Delhi woman from years earlier with no connection to the events, it was too late. The government imposed a curfew and an internet blackout to contain the spread of unrest. Meanwhile, rampaging mobs continued to fight an ethnic war in the streets. Dozens more were killed in the following weeks, and by July, some 60,000 people in Manipur had fled their homes to escape the mobs. The government's main strategy became separation. Put the Kukis up in the hills and keep the Meitei in the Imphal Valley, and pray it had enough soldiers to enforce the divisions. This division created its own problems. The historic inequalities in investment meant that this division deprived Kukis of many things, especially hospitals, which were now cordoned off into unofficial Meitei territory. God forbid if a Kuki suffers from a heart attack or is grievously injured in a road accident here, one doctor said. We can't take him down to Imphal for emergency treatment. Sexual violence was widespread and contributed to the cycle of chaos. Stories of women abducted, beaten, and violated became some of the most potent fuel for the mobs. For example, on May 4th, 2 Kuki women were dragged into a rice paddy in Kangpokpi and violated by a mob of Meitei. We will do to you what your men did to our women, they said, seeing the attacks as reprisals for alleged sexual violence by Kukis against Meitei. Videos of the attack reached social media, where they went viral across India. It even reached Parliament, where MPs condemned the shocking scenes and demanded the government intervene. Prime Minister Modi, who had been largely silent on the violence up to that point, lamented that the attacks shamed India and insisted that no guilty will be spared. That was easier said than done. Abductions and rapes continued on both sides, but the police failed to investigate almost any of it. Many of the abductions and rapes were linked to various militant groups. The suspension of operation agreement from 2008 was still in effect, but Meitei critics argued that it had only preserved the Kuki militants, who were now skipping out of the camps to join the violence. The first wave of violence burned through the summer, leaving at least 130 people dead, tens of thousands of refugees, and an unknown number of rape victims. By late 2023, Manipur had descended into a state of simmering low-level violence, where militant groups on both sides continue to attack each other and roam the streets openly in areas where the government is too afraid to tread. Meanwhile, the slightest trigger could set the mobs off again in another wave of protests and burning. Violence comes in cycles, with a few weeks of relative peace broken by violent outbursts as a new murder, a new rape, or a new attack reignites ethnic conflict. The government-enforced buffer zones keeping the Meitei and Kuki apart has slowed the worst of the violence, but it has not solved it. Central and state governments have spent 2024 unable to produce a solution. The insurgent groups have proven too difficult to nail down, and the ethnic divisions among the regular people too painful to make peace or the withdrawal of troops a realistic option. The governments in Imphal and Delhi will not entertain calls for Kuki autonomy separated from Manipur. As a result, Manipur remains in a state of limbo. Barely a few weeks pass without a new tale of tragedy. For example, on September 1st, 2024, Nyangbam Surbala and her 11-year-old daughter were driving down the road when they were fired upon at random by Kuki militants. Nyangbam died at the scene, and her young daughter narrowly survived a serious gunshot wound. The conflict is evolving too. Also in September, reports that militant groups were now using explosive drones opened up a new dimension for the conflict. Survivors from a clash between Kuki militia and government forces in the village of Kotruk reported the militia dropping bombs from remote-controlled drones. "We are used to defending the village from mortar shells," one villager said, "but we're not prepared that Kukis would use this much technology to attack us." Tangmin Lun Mate, a Kuki, described the devastating impacts the divisions were still having on Kuki communities. His own father had only headed out to fetch tools from the hardware store, but when he did not return, Tangmin Lun became worried. He went searching to no avail. It was only the next morning that he opened social media to find graphic videos of his father's body, beaten to death by members of a Meitei militia. His father had accidentally crossed into Meitei territory and paid the price. He could not even retrieve his father's body, since the morgue was also in Meitei territory. As of November 2024, curfews have been reintroduced after a new wave of violence, which included attacks on police stations and the homes of politicians. This outburst stems from the abduction, rape, and murder of Kuki women in the Jiribam district on November 7th, which was answered with the abduction, rape, and murder of Meitei women following a Kuki attack on a Meitei refugee camp. The bodies were found tossed into a river. There is no end in sight for the violence in Manipur. Ethnic relations remain in pieces. Manipur remains a highly militarized zone, and barely a few weeks can pass without some new tragedy causing another flare-up. Solving the crisis is one of the most important but most neglected issues facing the Indian government today.